Hi, everybody. I am super excited to be hosting another episode of Groundwork TV. Today, we're going to be talking about reproductive rights, particularly in the Deep South. I'm Joe, I think as you know, one of the founders of Groundwork Project. I'm here with Kelsey Ianuzzi, who is the director of a documentary called Show Me the Line. Kelsey, thank you so much for being here with us. Before we dive into the details of the documentary, tell us a little just bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and how you got into this work.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you so much for having me as part of Groundwork TV. I'm a filmmaker and I'm an artist who grew up in Alabama. I consider it my home state. And a little bit about my background: for many years, I produced educational documentary media for Alabama's PBS station, focusing largely on cultural and creative output in our state. And I was not so much drawn to make this doc as it was kind of called to it. It rattled me out of a cozy, steady paycheck editing branded and commercial media because the story was just on my doorstep. Abby Crane, one of the film's key participants and a dear friend, was really the only person I knew who had gone through IVF besides my mother, because I'm an IVF baby. And so until this started, that's where I was. But since the two of us were storytellers and had this connection to the material, we began working together immediately after the Alabama State Supreme Court ruled that embryos were children, which ended up closing her clinic temporarily and interrupting access to her own embryos.
Which is a wild story, and it's obviously the story you're going to start to tell about the consequences of that. We'll get into it. Let me just jump right in. The document is called Show Me the Line. Walk us through it a little bit. You just alluded to Abby, but talk us through kind of how this came up. How did it end on your doorstep? And, just because something ends up on my doorstep doesn't mean I go make a movie about it. So walk me through that journey.
Yeah. Well, so in February of 2024, Alabama State Supreme Court ruled that IVF embryos, or frozen embryos created through IVF, had personhood and were legally children. The film Show Me the Line documents the lives of 4 women in Alabama after this IVF ruling, and their journeys are really the focus of the film for several key reasons. One, we felt those human perspectives were missing from the broader conversations around the law and deserve to be amplified. We also felt at the time that our best chance of initiating some transformative conversations around this were going to be directly tied to our ability to connect audiences with characters that they could relate to. And then on a more logistic level, we realized very quickly that tracking the development of the law in a procedural sense was going to be difficult with no end in sight, because things were shifting moment to moment. And 20 months later, there is still not a legal resolution to IVF in Alabama. So that was a good call at that time. And on a deeper level, the film is about creative resilience. When audiences meet Abby, she is disillusioned with the power of voice, and she's exhausted after years of simultaneously reporting on gender issues in the South as a reporter while going through fertility treatments. And she covers the fall of Roe and this sort of rollback on rights as a part of her beat in Alabama. She's going through that as it's all hitting really close to home for her. But audiences also get to witness Abby as she transmutes her grief and rage into something more meaningful through an art project that she begins to honor other patients impacted by this ruling.
Powerful narrative and obviously powerful experience. Can you break this down to, I think I understand the legal ramifications of judges appointed to the Supreme Court making a decision essentially about when life begins. And if life begins at conception, then these fertilized embryos are children, and so therefore they have rights for children.
Yes.
Medical science doesn't necessarily align with that, right? But that is the interpretation that these justices made. What are the practical ramifications then of that? And obviously that's part of what you depict in a very human way for a woman and a family going through this, several families going through this. But walk us through a little bit, because I think some folks might understand what that means. Some folks would say, hey, wow, that seems like a stretch from a legal interpretation standpoint, but what's the practical, they come down with this ruling, what happens?
Immediately what happens is the clinics in the state are like, whoa, we don't actually have answers in terms of our own liability for best practices of care. The case in particular involved 3 families whose embryos had been damaged and mismanaged by the clinic. And so they were suing on a wrongful death instead of property loss. And they do, I'm of the opinion that they deserve some sort of accountability for the loss that they incurred. But because it went to the state Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court said, yes, these frozen embryos are people, the practical fallout is that even with the advances of modern medicine, clinics start to question,
yes, their legal liability.
Can we be sued? And patients as well. There is a moment in the film where one of our participants gets a email from their clinic that sort of outlines all these outstanding questions at the time, which are, we don't really know what we can be held criminally liable for. And even moving embryos out of state comes into question, because not only did clinics shut down, but all transportation services were shut down as well. So is it child trafficking to move embryos out of state? These are the kinds of legal outstanding questions that people in the state are facing.
And thank you for taking some time to kind of unpack it, because as I articulated it, life begins at, if you believe that life begins at conception, embryos are children, the logic kind of flows from there. The challenge being, again, setting aside a medical perspective on this, right? The challenge being, this is such a foundational shift in the way in which the legal context is now going to be interpreted, that essentially the questions for doctors, clinics, parents about many of the families that I know that have gone through IVF, it wasn't successful in the first attempts. It takes multiple attempts. And in fact, I think that's what doctors actually tell families, is that this oftentimes is a long journey. And that if there then are questions around liability, particularly if you're thinking about these embryos as a human life, just as you said, now all of a sudden there's myriad questions that are unanswered about the ramifications of that decision. And so what happens? They close, they stop, because what can you do? You don't know. And so now with one decision, families that are desperate to try to begin a family or to have another child, they can't do that in Alabama. Is that essentially what's happening?
That did happen. Yeah. And then shortly after this ruling happens, people in Alabama raise their voices. They say, actually, IVF is really important to us, and we want to be able to access this. We're trying to build our families here. I mean, it had a devastating impact on people across the state. And so coalitions formed, and advocates were able to convince lawmakers instead of the state Supreme Court. Since this happened in the courts instead of in a legislative session, lawmakers responded fairly quickly to get a immunity bill passed. And that is the same protective measure that clinics are continuing to operate under today. And what that measure does is protect the clinics from liability. But you can see that there are contradictory legal premises at play here. And in the last year, that immunity bill has been challenged. And so families who were able to continue their care are still wondering, like, whether this could all happen again.
I think that's super important to understand, right? Families raise their voices, great. Legislature corrects it to say, hey, now we start to understand that there's massive ramifications for this that weren't necessarily contemplated, so we pass a bill. But the legal, or the theory behind that runs into the application of that precedent. And so on the one hand, solve short term, on the other hand, it's going to get challenged by folks that are advocating a different position. It's going to go up to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court upholds the legality of that law, it directly contradicts the precedent they just wrote.
And in particular, in Alabama, advocates and legal experts are saying that this lack of full legal protection of IVF goes back to the 2018 Sanctity of Life bill, because that is constitutional in Alabama. And most advocates that I've spoken with believe that a constitutional amendment is the only way to protect IVF fully in the state.
I want to dive into that for a second here, because we're just discussing kind of the legal principles at work, but as the film details with Abby, and not just her story, but that of several other families, as a representation for what is now taking place across the consequence across all of Alabama, where families are trying to grow. The timeliness of this is important, right? Reproductive rights have been under attack across this country, but particularly in the South, for decades, and we've seen rollbacks as a result. Obviously, you mentioned the erosion of Roe and the overturning of Roe that came out of a state court case in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about why it's so important for folks to understand this story in this moment.
It's all related, I think, in that what we are seeing is that IVF and the access to this family fertility healthcare, fertility medicine. Infertility is a disease that affects 1 in 6 people globally. It is a disease, and the treatment for that disease, or one treatment for that disease, is IVF. It's not a guarantee, but it provides miracles for people. And because of the way that it works, this personhood legal framework puts it at stake. And we're seeing that attempts to restrict any aspects of reproductive health care have unintended consequences that affect people who may not even realize that their ability to grow a family is being impacted.
And we've seen this as the access to reproductive rights come under attack in various forms for a long time, but have particular resonance in the South, given the power structures that exist there. And as you said, that perhaps the best and truest defense in Alabama is going to be a constitutional amendment, which I would imagine would be a very difficult path forward given the current context, right?
That's what the advocates are telling me.
Yeah, put mildly. I also want to highlight that different communities have a harder time accessing reproductive care that need them, right? And that can be for a number of reasons. But we've seen this throughout the country, particularly after the Roe was overturned. If there was limitations in certain states, but access to reproductive or abortion services elsewhere, they could travel across state lines, but some folks can't, or they have to travel much further. That has to take a lot longer, more expensive, et cetera. Beyond Abby's story, what other perspectives are you including in the film to show the broader impact across Alabama?
As you mentioned, we have a history in Alabama of the rollback of rights, and disproportionately that impacts disenfranchised communities. And that is potentially by design and related to a long history of an imbalance of power in the Deep South. And when we talk about personhood and bodily autonomy, to me, there is also this connection back to Alabama has legislated personhood and body autonomy for decades and centuries, and it has not always given equal status to its populations. And with IVF can be prohibitively expensive for many people. It is a type of care that everyone deserves, but not everyone has access to. And when we talk about Alabama as well, we have to think about the fact that we have abysmal maternal health care and childhood mortality rates in this state. And it's even worse if you're a person of color. I think it is the most dangerous state to be a mother of color in this country, because we have healthcare deserts, maternal healthcare deserts. In the state, there have been challenges to maternal health centers, birthing centers, midwives and doulas. I think midwifery was made illegal for several years in our state, and that also disproportionately affects Black women and women of color. And so all of that is kind of tied into this, and the film follows several women's journeys and tries to expose perspective to that. But we're also working with historians and legal experts and advocates who can help us paint that bigger picture in the film.
I want you to talk about that for a second. Right, a incredibly powerful story, and documentaries can be an extremely effective way at telling a narrative to people across different audiences through obviously a unique medium. What are you hoping that the documentary accomplishes? Do you have goals that you have in mind about the advancements or protection of reproductive rights, or kind of what's your hope for the film?
Yeah, my hope for the film is really that it can reach people and start a dialogue, perhaps without some of the heat of the conversation that people in the South are particularly sensitive to. Don't typically talk about these things, or there's a big stigma against it. Communities of privilege who have maybe more power to impact legislation or to even access IVF and understand that these things are coming for them too. I think a lot of people that I've talked to through the course of making the film did not realize until this interrupted their care dramatically that the constitutional amendment and sanctity of life was going to impact them. And I think the film creates an opportunity to reach some of those people who still didn't make those connections. And also, this journey is really it's grueling. It has a dramatic impact, not only on your physical health to go through fertility treatment, but your mental health. I think it's one of the most stressful. I think they did a study in the 90s and found that people going through IVF had the same level of stress that cancer patients have. I mean, it rules your life, and it's very time sensitive, and there's a level of cyclical grief, long-term uncertainty that these families are going through. And I wanted to be able to have their stories be witnessed by an audience. People could understand that, and that it wouldn't just be something that's hidden behind closed doors. Having conversations is the ultimate goal.
And good for you. It's a powerful film that tells that story in a very, very compelling way, and a very real human consequence to decisions that, without necessarily thinking through the ramifications of them. I know we're kind of at time here, but I want to wrap up by asking what's on the horizon for Show Me the Line and how people might be able to support your work.
Yeah. Right now, we're in a big push for finishing funds. So donations, large and small, are a big help. It takes many people to make a film, but we're editing, and we are targeting an early 2026 release for the film because we want to have an impact campaign and really facilitate some of these conversations that I'm talking about. So we want to take the film across the country and host events and offer opportunities to engage around the material, not just throw it up somewhere and someone can stream it or whatever. We want to bring people together and really have a dialogue. Folks can find us at showmetheline.com. We have a newsletter if you're interested in getting involved in some sort of way, or if you're an organizer, if you have access to venues or things like that, please reach out to us because we want to work together and get the film out.
Kelsey, thank you. Thank you for your vision, your dedication, your advocacy, and for when this showed up on your doorstep, taking it and running with it, because it's such an important story that so many people need to see and hear and understand. As you said, highlight some of those existing power structures and cultural propriety and politeness, but there's real world impacts for all of those things. And you do a hell of a job telling that story. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we do feel like it's more important than ever to get it's a very urgent and timely film. That's why we're hustling to get it out.